Okay, thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Jo Catras, and I am with University of Minnesota Extension in the Department of Family, Health, and Wellbeing. And we're glad to see you all here today for our webinar, Indigenous Evaluation 101. And I just wanted to, I'll turn it over to our presenters in just a moment, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this funding for this webinar comes from the Great Lakes Rural Opioid Technical Assistance Regional Center Grant that's funded by SAMHSA. And we are a regional center that comes together from Region 5, so it includes Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. I think I have all of those states in there. Sometimes I miss some, but they're on the screen. And we come together to work around opioid and recovery and substance use, misuse across our region. And so just wanted to acknowledge that the funding for that comes from that grant and our work together. And then whenever we do anything, we just like to begin really reminding words do matter, and that we really come from a person-centered approach where we want to make sure that we're using affirming person-first language when discussing behavioral health disorders. And so you'll see that that will be modeled in our conversation today, and we have that expectation for our conversation together. So, okay. If let's see, I'm trying to think any housekeeping items, if you could just make sure that you're muted, that would be wonderful. This is being recorded and we will have it up on our project website for those that want to share it or listen again. Questions can be asked in the chat throughout the presentation and they will be addressed either throughout if it makes sense or at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to our presenters today, Jennifer Garbow and Dr. Nicole MartinRogers.
Hi, bonjour, everyone. I'm Nicole MartinRogers. I'm a White Earth Nation descendant. I'm coming to you today from Roseville, Minnesota, which is Dakota homeland. I've lived in the Twin Cities my whole life, and I've been doing program evaluation and research for about the past 25 years or so. I'll turn it to Jennifer.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Bonjour. My name is Jennifer Garbow, and I think we actually have a slide to introduce ourselves a bit more, but how we would like to get started is we have a small group here today, which is great because we might have a chance for a little bit more interaction, which is also great. So if you could put your name in the chat, your preferred pronouns, the organization or institution you're from, and then just rating on a scale from 1 to 4, how much evaluation experience do you have? So we'll just take a minute for everyone to do that.
Sorry, I had to interrupt myself there. Of course, as soon as we started this, my dog saw the guy mowing the lawn in the back and started barking. So apologize for that, but I booted him out of my room. So hopefully he's not going to cause us any more problems here. Looks like we've got some folks with some evaluation experience joining us today. Always a little bit intimidating to present on a topic that you know, when you have a lot, especially when you have other people that have a lot of experience or expertise, but just want to acknowledge that everybody is learning. I'm learning, even though I've been doing this for a long time. Jennifer's learning, you know, we're learning from each other, and happy to be learning with you all here today. But it's okay, whatever experience you have in an evaluation, you probably have expertise in some other topic that we can learn from you on today as well. So. Anything else you want to say on this slide, Jennifer, before we go on?
No, I think that's it.
All right. So again, welcome everybody. It's good to see you all and thanks for making the time today. We're going to talk about what is evaluation and what is Indigenous evaluation and some particular methods and approaches that we have used and tried and liked in different Indigenous evaluation settings. talk a little bit about logic models, which in this case might be for this audience. Some people probably have a lot of familiarity with this tool. And then we'll talk at the end about common evaluation challenges, in particular Indigenous evaluation challenges, and what some of the solutions are that we have found for those. So I'm just going to jump right in, and like Mary Jo said, if you have questions or if you need anything from us, please feel free to put it in the chat. I won't be looking at it while I'm talking, so Jennifer, feel free to speak up if there's anything that we need to pause for a second to attend to. Otherwise, I'm going to jump right in. So evaluation is a process of gathering data about a program and interpreting it to determine the program's effectiveness and also identifying areas for improvement. Evaluation is a cycle, so we really should use the information that we gather to improve the program, and then we need to evaluate again or assess if the changes that we made had the desired impact. And as you all know, funders often require us to do an evaluation as a part of a grant funding or grant requirements. Indigenous evaluation really uses the same or similar cycle of gathering data to inform program improvements. And really what's different about Indigenous evaluation is that it's designed to be culturally relevant and aligned with culturally based interventions. So especially when you're doing an intervention that's culturally based and or done in an Indigenous community or tribal community, that's when this type of evaluation is particularly useful. And again, the evaluation is going to be a little different in that it will reflect Indigenous cultural values and worldviews. It will incorporate cultural protocols as appropriate. For example, gifting tobacco to an elder to ask them to open a meeting with a prayer before you do a listening session. We've been doing that in some of the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives listening sessions that I've been doing. Those are something like an example of a cultural protocol that we can do to make people feel more comfortable in the evaluation process. And then, of course, using culturally relevant and responsive data collection, analysis, and reporting. A lot of times I find that participatory approaches lend themselves to being a little more culturally responsive. We'll talk about some more of those in a little bit. And then importantly, we want to make sure that the process of the evaluation and the end results are useful for the community or the tribe, that they're not just designed to go back to a funder and give back to them and never inform the community about what they're doing. So we want to make sure that evaluation results are useful in an Indigenous context. And I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
Great. And I realized I probably didn't do a proper introduction of myself. So again, my name is Jennifer Garbow, and I'm with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm the new director of American Indian Affairs and Programs, and I've been working on this Indigenous evaluation project for a little over a year now with Nicole. And I appreciate, Nicole, that you shared that, you know, we're all have different levels of knowledge and understanding about both evaluation and then Indigenous evaluation. And then all of us bring different gifts to this space that we can share. So what we thought we would do is have a bit of a discussion. Hold on, I'm trying to get to my full screen here. Okay. So a couple of questions, and this is just an open discussion. There's 14 of us on, and so I think if you're comfortable to turn your cameras on and we can just chat a bit. So what can we use how can we use Indigenous evaluation to improve our work? And then the second question is, what are you hoping to learn about Indigenous evaluation? So first question, how can we use Indigenous evaluation to improve our work that we're doing? And then what are you hoping to learn? And we'll just take a few minutes. Nicole, maybe you can be my timekeeper. Sometimes I have a tendency to go on too long, so.
I got that.
Perfect.
We actually got here pretty early, so we have a little bit of time that we can spend if folks want to talk, or we don't have to if it's people don't have a lot to say, but it'll be good to hear, especially what you're hoping to learn today about Indigenous evaluation. See, Elder June has her hand up. I can only see a couple of people, but
yes.
Thank you. So I just want to thank Jennifer and Nicole for all the work they've done behind the scenes to get to bring this thought process forward. So I was at a meeting and I joint powers meeting with the Ramsey County and I had mentioned that what have we lost because we don't have all perspectives as humanity. So think about the inventions that never came forth, the way of doing things differently, which in the systems is not a good thing. They want everything in a box. So what I want to bring forth is Indigenous evaluation adds a richness, and it opens up your thought process and your mind, that we can add more heart to this work. It doesn't just have to be cut and dried data. So even if you aren't Indigenous, just bringing forth this thought process of honoring people for their time and respecting the elders and the children. So that's kind of my thought process is, bringing forth many thoughts. So thank you very much.
Jimmy Gwitch for sharing that, Elder June. I was just at a meeting earlier this morning, and we talked about at our place of work that we bring our whole selves, but sometimes we bring our minds and we tend to leave our hearts at home because we are worried that we might not be professional or it's not okay to share emotions and feelings at our workplace, but we know that that isn't who we are. We bring our whole selves. And so I think to create spaces and have conversations that it's okay to feel with our hearts and to do our work with our hearts, because many of us do this work because we really deeply care about it. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Any other thoughts? What are you hoping to learn about Indigenous evaluation?
I see there was a comment in the chat. Looking forward to learning more information about responsive and respectful processes. Definitely think we'll get into that a little bit. See Jennifer has her hand up.
Hi, I am also involved in a Native American Studies Circle in Wisconsin, and we're reading Heartberries, a memoir right now. It's amazing, actually. But it was interesting because the conversations we've had initially about the book, it really came from a deficit model, and this is like an and I'm really hopeful that we could just change the way we look at evaluation, the way we look at culture, and away from that. But yeah, if y'all can read Heartberries, it's really good.
Jen, can you put that the link in the chat, please, for everyone to the book?
Since you asked so nicely, Jennifer, I will.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
See Susan has her hand up.
Yeah, hi. I'm kind of hoping that the indigenous model, and expecting really that it's more collaborative. Like the even qualitative evaluation now is kind of after the fact. I mean, you don't bring community in, as far as I have seen, to talk about what questions need to be answered. And to think about what the evaluation would be. It's kind of like determine, okay, there will be an evaluation, you get the questions, and then it becomes collaborative. And that seems a little late in the process. And so I'm just curious if it's a different process, Indigenous evaluation, and more collaborative. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the first way I would answer that is Indigenous evaluation isn't a thing where you can go out and get a manual and it tells you do this, then do this, then do this. So probably in some cases, it's more participatory all the way through it. And in other cases, it's more like the model that you said of a little bit more standard Western evaluation where there's a little bit less engagement. So just an example of one project that I've been working on is the preschool development grant, Indigenous evaluation. So there's a number of grantees around the state that are sub-granted through the Department of Education in Minnesota. And they're doing a range of different programs with Indigenous children and families. Some are tribal and some are urban. And we did co-design process with those grantees to kind of ideate around what the evaluation could look like. And they really did help us kind of come up with some of the methodologies. Like we developed this grandma test observation tool that was based on a direct suggestion from one of the grantees about how we can assess how well our children are doing in an Indigenous early childhood setting. And so I do really like the idea of doing that, that type of engaged approach. It just takes a little bit more time and more resources, and we don't necessarily always have all that available, but when we do, it's great to be able to do that. And just one other thing I wanted to say too is Pukan, sorry if I said your name wrong, but said in the chat, I'm hoping to learn how to use culturally appropriate methods and tools that are familiar to Indigenous peoples and that respect their culture and values. And one other example I just wanted to name quickly that we did with the preschool development grant is we've been going out to different community events like powwows at school districts and other community settings. And we have this bead voting booth where we have little beads in a container and we hand them to families and we say, put a bead in each jar for our early childhood resource that you or your family has used. And those are all blue beads. And then we give them a couple of orange beads, just like 3 orange beads. And we say, pick the ones that were most important to you, that you use the most, and put the orange beads there. And people are really drawn to that activity because there's beads, right? And what like Native mom isn't gonna be like, what are those beads over there, right? And so they like come over to see what we're doing, and it's a hands-on activity. It's not real taxing emotionally or otherwise, right? They can quickly kind of do it, give them a maple candy for their kids for afterwards and stuff. So that's an example of a way that I think, you can still get some really, and people, a lot of people, like hundreds of people across several different events have shared information with us this way that helps us learn what's working for families with young kids in Minnesota. And so, and I think that people have enjoyed participating in it. So that's maybe an example of like a culturally based methodology. Maybe take time if we have for, I don't know if there's any other one more quick comment, otherwise we can.
I think Hinjin posted a question in the chat. Let me see. I'm not great at navigating.
Yeah, he did. You want me to read it?
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah. Can an evaluator who is not from an Indigenous culture do Indigenous evaluation?
Nicole, I think I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think it probably would depend on who you ask to some degree. And also, like for myself, I identify as mixed, Indigenous, and white, but I didn't grow up real traditional, right? Like I don't speak the language. I don't live in a super traditional way. And so some might even question me doing Indigenous evaluation, even though I have Indigenous background. But I work with a lot of non-Indigenous colleagues that want to do it.
I'll also just add that ideally, if you can partner with an Indigenous person, sometimes through that kind of mentorship partnership, it can really be helpful. So, for myself as an Indigenous woman, just really learning about evaluation and then more specifically Indigenous evaluation, it helps me to partner with others who are more knowledgeable. So that could be an approach. And, within the University of Minnesota Extension, one of my hopes, one of my ambitions is that the work that Nicole and I are doing, while it's specific right now to some grants in family health and well-being, that we can scale it up, and that, as Elder June spoke of, that even if you're not an Indigenous person working with Indigenous people, our approach to evaluation can be really meaningful and important for other groups as well. And so there are things I think that we can learn from each other, but it does get a little sticky. And I think in terms of navigating those kinds of things, if you have an Indigenous person like Nicole or myself or Elder June to partner with, I think that that would probably be the best approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And where I work at Wilder Research, I have a number of colleagues who are not Indigenous who have a ton of experience working with tribal communities and Indigenous organizations, but we almost always use the practice of at least having an Indigenous person involved somehow in the project from the beginning, to kind of honor that that's a good way of working with the community, someone who has connections in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on?
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna talk a bit about Indigenous evaluations, evaluation approaches and methods. And Nicole shared this with me, and I don't speak Dakota, so I hope that I'll pronounce this word right, but Wopasi, is that how it's pronounced, Nicole?
A little bit more like Wopasi.
Wopasi.
But I'm not Dakota either, but I think it's a little bit more like that, yeah.
Okay. So Lemoyne Lapointe is a friend of Nicole's, and she's been working with him for a long time around Indigenous evaluation and other projects. And this is what he, this is a definition that he came up with. And I just love it. And I actually hope that as our Indigenous evaluation project grows with an extension, that we could come up with an appropriate, probably an Ojibwe word, because most of us who are doing this work right now are Ojibwe with an extension. So in the Lakota language, the term Wopasi means to pursue inquiry, to push the limitations of one's knowledge, and to seek greater understanding by looking for meaning and wisdom above, beneath, and all around. And so how I interpret this is that the approach and the methods is really about seeking knowledge and wisdom in a gentle and appreciative way, and then sharing that new knowledge with others, which I think really speaks to the responsibility that we have as Indigenous people to one another and to our communities. So as we learn, we share that knowledge, and that helps us in kind of a circular pattern to continue to learn and grow. We don't wait until we've arrived necessarily at a place, because we're all in process of learning and growing, both individually and collectively. And so I'm trying to model that in this work that I'm doing, and not wait for myself professionally and personally to have arrived at a place of completely understanding evaluation and what Indigenous evaluation is. But I've had the opportunity to learn a great deal in this last year. And so by sharing with you all, it's helping me to learn, and it's also helping you to learn, I hope. So there are cultural protocols around greetings and relationship building and information sharing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on an upcoming slide. And, the Indigenous way of seeing the world is really about being inquisitive and also listening. So it's important to know when to ask questions, how to ask the questions, and then probably the most important piece, at least in my experience, is to really listen with an open heart and an open mind. And you learn a lot more by listening, I feel like, than talking. And so that's culturally appropriate for Indigenous evaluation. Oh, and one other thing that I did want to mention, if you could just go back real quick, Nicole, is that one really important consideration, I think, in the approaches and the methods is to include the spiritual when gathering information. That spiritual piece is really important. Sometimes when we think about gathering information, we think about gathering numbers, we think about gathering facts, we think about, really concrete things that we can put in reports, and that's important. And we all know that, especially if you're part of a grant team, that we have those responsibilities. But what's really important, and that you might not hear in other evaluation spaces, is around Indigenous evaluation is to consider those spiritual aspects, which also includes language, which includes a lot of other pieces. And that is really important to understand. And it's okay if you're not really deeply knowledgeable. It's okay just to say, I'm not really deeply knowledgeable about this. However, I'm willing, I have an open heart, and I'm willing to listen. Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you, Elder June. Okay, next slide, please. So to continue on down this vein of approaches and methods, we at the University of Minnesota, we have an IRB board, as many of you do. I didn't get a chance to see in the chat where you're all from, but I know that we have some colleagues here from Wisconsin and other institutions. So that's one level. There are also other levels. So for example, some tribal nations have their own IRB processes. And I'm sorry, now my dog is barking downstairs. I hope that's not too, he's distracting me a bit. I hope that's not distracting any of you. And okay, I think he's done. He has to cycle through. The animush, he's got to cycle through. So, and there are also things such as good relations agreements and data sovereignty. So data sovereignty is a bit, I don't think it's a new concept, but it's basically the idea of sovereignty. So tribal nations are sovereign nations. They have the ability to self-govern their lands and their peoples, and data sovereignty along those same lines is that information that's gathered or collected, if it's in partnership with our tribal partners, that data belongs to them. And so we really need to be careful that we're not overstepping or using the data in ways that weren't agreed upon in the beginning, when the relationship and the goals and objectives, if it's a grant project or if it's another project, that we're not overstepping those bounds. So I think it's important for us as non-native institutions that we really go above and beyond to be extremely respectful and to ask questions. It's okay if we don't know the answer. It's just okay to ask questions. That's much more appreciated than making assumptions and doing something that could be harmful. So collecting data in a good way, some important factors, the cultural appropriateness. We should make sure that it's relevant and useful and used. And so one example that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about doing an evaluation with Indigenous people is, am I going to report this back to them? Yes, I have actually an ethical obligation. Oftentimes, Indigenous people experience an extraction of information, and then there's never a full cycle or loop that it goes back and is shared with them. And then actually the first piece, I got a bit ahead of myself. The first piece is this evaluation going to be beneficial to the people that I'm evaluating? So the questions I'm asking, are they co-developed in some way? By asking and answering these questions, is it going to help to inform the people that we're serving to make informed decisions? And then of course the piece that I've talked about in the previous slide, to have that data protected and respected. And then analyzing data in a good way, the contextualization and the co-interpretation is really important because there's context. So oftentimes, Jen, you mentioned sort of a deficit approach when working with tribal nations. And unfortunately, a lot of federal grant language kind of takes the deficit approach because they're trying to say, here's an issue and these are the statistics to support the health disparity or the substance use disparity or educational disparity, whatever the disparity may be, they're showing that there's an issue here to work on, which is important, but we have to have the contextualization as educators. So we need to think about how did, we need to ask questions. How did these Indigenous folks end up in this position? It isn't happenstance. It isn't poor choices, right? It isn't because there's some deficit inherent within them and their families and their communities. There's a lot of history. And I think it's important for us, if we're engaging with tribal nations, and this is kind of a high level, this does go beyond evaluation, but it's all very interrelated, that we have some basic understanding and knowledge about how reservations came to be and, some history. And if anyone is interested at the University of Minnesota Extension, we do have some longer workshops and things through our American Indian Resource and Resiliency team that we talk about Minnesota history and tribal relations. And then that co-interpretation, what does the data mean? How will it be shared? What does it mean for the people? I don't want to rush, but I also get a little long-winded. So Nicole, you can tell me to keep clipping along here. Okay. Culturally appropriate data gathering. And I think, Susan, you may have mentioned this or someone else earlier on, there are different ways to go about. So within evaluation, my understanding is there are a number of methods and approaches, and some are maybe more conducive to the cultural evaluations that we're speaking about today, such as informal conversation. And, you may not get all your questions answered when you speak to an Indigenous person or an Indigenous group, but you'll learn a lot. So it's important to go in with understanding that it's okay to be flexible and to manage your expectations. Observation, photo voice, harvest poetry, story banking, ripple effect, mapping, and graphic recording. And I did skip over the talking circles because I actually think the talking circles, the focus groups, and different types of group reflection activities is a really gentle and culturally appropriate way to be in a space with an Indigenous audience and to learn from them, and also to gather data. So it's important that we gather information and data. We have a lot of folks that we're responsible to report to, but if we create an environment that people feel comfortable. So for example, in talking circles, there may be an item or an object that's passed around, right? It could be a stone, a rock, it could be a feather or something like that. And this isn't trivializing a talking circle if you understand kind of some basic components of it. It's important. So the person who, and I happen to have my stress ball apple and extension apple in my hand right now when I get a little anxious and grab it. But say, for example, this is the rock that the facilitator brings in. This rock is important to them. It means something to them. And they pass it around. So the person that is holding that rock, everyone else is listening and giving them their full attention and really hearing what they have to say. And when they're done speaking, they pass it along. And in that process, it's a respectful and gentle way, I think, to gather information and also share information. So when Nicole and I first started this journey together, one of the questions that came to us as we met with our Indigenous educators within family health and well-being is evaluating healing. And there's a gap in literature and understanding and knowledge in this area. And I see it as an opportunity for us to contribute probably significantly to this gap in knowledge and understanding. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about evaluating healing, I'll give you a really quick example. So we have a tribal community facilitator that her primary crux of her work is around historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, understanding trauma, and then understanding how to heal from trauma. And so some of the questions that she had was around how do we evaluate healing? And so these bullet points came out of a really intimate discussion that Nicole and I had with this individual. So different communities are in different places. And, we have 11 tribal nations in the state of Minnesota, and they're not homogenous. We have 7 Anishinaabe in the north. We have 4 Dakota communities in the south. And even amongst those 2 groups, there are many different differences, many different interests. They're at a lot of different places. Geography is different. And so it goes back to relationships, I think, and having a relationship with the group that you plan to work with, and thinking about, the readiness to heal, looking at, are they interested? I learned from Elder June that she said, I know that this group is ready to heal because they keep showing up. So they're committing themselves, their time, their energy, their voice. And so I learned a lot in just that interaction with Elder June that, if people are asking for something and they're showing up, there's a level of readiness there. Do folks have the coping skills? So it's one thing to understand trauma and the implications of historical trauma within Indigenous communities. And then the second issue that it really begs the question to be answered is, do the folks have the tools and the resources and the abilities to move through the trauma? Not to forget about the trauma and just move on, but to move through it. Do they have the supports that they need to do that? And then stability and lifestyle, substance use disorder is really high in Indigenous communities for a lot of reasons that I've talked about. So looking to see if the different groups that you might work with, are they in recovery versus active use? And again, no judgment. It's just simply something that we might need to know going into a space. Okay, I think that's it for that slide. And again, circling back to that high demand for services, are folks asking for something? Are they asking for something different than what we have to offer? Does that mean we need to kind of take a step back and regroup and look to develop some new resources or education or technical assistance to address their needs? So we might not be ready to go to the evaluation piece, but we might need to look at revising or creating some new programming to address the needs. And it's important to have, when we talk about survivors, we're talking about essentially surviving genocide within our nation. As Indigenous people here before you, we have in fact survived genocide. Our relatives and our ancestors have. And so it is important to understand that these types of really deep issues exist within the fabric of tribal communities. And our approach might be a little bit different. For example, boarding school survivors, there's a lot of programs now and different things that are coming out, and how organizations are working with those survivors is probably a little bit different. And so it's important to understand that contextualization when approaching this work.
I just would add really quick that Indigenous worldviews a lot of times are really emphasize the relatedness and connectedness of all people and all living things in the world. And so when we've talked with the Indigenous educators at U of M Extension, they talk about how it's kind of like when individuals heal, then the community heals. And when the community heals, then individuals heal. So we have to think about that kind of cycle between what's happening at the individual and community level, and that both are happening, can support each other. Should I go on, Jennifer?
Yes, please. Okay, so here's a point where we're going to take
We
a few
actually maybe, I
minutes.
wonder if we should maybe skip this just so we have time
Sure.
for questions at the end. Is that okay with you if we skip over this?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time and.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I probably went a little too
No,
long.
it's okay. We're good. We're just, I think, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end, hopefully, for some discussion questions or whatever you all want to talk about. So,
Okay.
I'm not going to take a lot of time on this because I know a lot of you all already have pretty extensive evaluation experience. But the first step with an Indigenous evaluation often is developing a program theory or logic model, which is similar to any evaluation. And so we really want to ask ourselves these questions, but again, applying that Indigenous worldview to answer some of these. Why do we believe some activity will lead to a certain result? How are we incorporating culture into the program? And evidence might be different in the Indigenous evaluation sense than evidence like, is this an evidence-based practice, right? Because that's not always evidence in an Indigenous setting. Sometimes it's that an elder that you talk to has seen something play out in their community and that they've given you advice about that. So that term, I understand, kind of means different things in different settings. But using a logic model is a great tool for illustrating your program, of course, and same with Indigenous evaluation, which is why I want to actually show you a quick video if I can figure out how to do this now. Hopefully you all can see and hear this.
Our land was once full of strong and healthy cedar trees. Our Lummi people and children grew strong like the cedar, with access to the resources they needed to live healthy lives. It was a system of care based on the teachings and experiences of our ancestors.
But then came change. Very quickly and without our consent, many of the trees were cut down.
But not all trees were lost. Not all strength was gone from the nation and its people, and seeds of hope and renewal soon spread.
With the Lummi system of care, a seed has taken root in our community, a seed that carries our vision for a healing past and hopeful future for our children.
Roots connect resources, and working together, the resources help grow the seed and provide the foundation of a healthy system.
A strong system will grow strong trees, but for this cedar to stay strong, it must continue to be nurtured, protected, and valued as it grows.
A system that is nurtured will produce branches that reach out to capture and bring in additional resources that over time will transform the small sapling into a towering tree.
The cedar represents a healthy system grown from roots of resilience. Healthy systems are transformative by their nature. In our Chelangan, the cedar transforms to become a vehicle carrying our people and our culture forward. Standing together like the cedar puts us in the same canoe. Pulling together, By pulling together, this brings our children to new places and gets our children home.
So that was an example of an Indigenous logic model, which I really love, because I'm sure you can see how all the key components of, setting up an evaluation, talking about desired outcomes and activities and how are we going to do this, all those pieces are there, but it was told in the voice of the people and using traditional imagery and concepts that were important to their community. So that's just a way of how you can make something that's a standard evaluation tool like a logic model work in an Indigenous evaluation. And so I'm going to actually turn it back over to Jennifer. I'll share my screen again, Jennifer, and you can.
Oh, can you? There we go. So there are some challenges in serving Indigenous communities, and I actually believe that developing appropriate evaluations can really help kind of break through some of these challenges and barriers. So some of the challenges can be there's a lack of funding or a willingness on funders' parts to support culturally based interventions. They might not be as comfortable or familiar with some of the words even that we're using today, such as historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, healing, traditional approaches, those kinds of things. And so I look for I look at it as an opportunity, and I look for opportunities to share, through our grants. One of the thoughts that I've had in the beginning is, especially with federal grants, there are actually real people reading these reports in DC, and they might not know what they don't know. And so any chance that we have to create some new awareness and different things by our reporting and how we report and just our programming, I think can really go a long way. And it might not be seen to us, but I feel that it's reaching decision makers at a really high level that could impact a lot of different programs across the country. Another challenge is having access to the resources and relationships needed to do work in a trauma-informed way. So sometimes the relationships aren't there with our Indigenous relatives. And so we need to spend some time developing those relationships, and they do take time, and that's okay. That's an important piece of work. And then disparities and social determinants of health and trauma and stigma. And, we can reframe. I think, yes, we need to recognize and share that there are disparities. However, there's also resilience, there's beauty, there's thriving culture, there are thriving families and language. And so I think it's always important that if we have the opportunity to tell both sides, and I think evaluation can do that because it's the voice of the people coming forth, and then it's our responsibility to frame it in such a way that we're presenting their story. Okay. Next slide. So there are challenges, and some of the common challenges that I'm learning from Nicole, and I'm starting to be able to see for myself, is some of the required outcome measures. We typically tend to look at individual versus collective impacts. And I think there can be a shift when we talk about when the individual heals, the community heals, when the community heals, the individual heals. So to think about things not in a linear fashion, but to think about things in a holistic cycle that's ongoing. And really, evaluation is that. That's how I interpret it, that it's this ongoing cycle of improvement and learning and growing and make adjustments and improving based on, at the heart of it in the center is what the individual and the community want as an outcome. typically there's a heavy emphasis on the academic and financial versus the spiritual or the wellness outcomes. However, I think in the last 5 years in working with the grant projects that I have worked with, I think that's starting to shift and change. And I believe that we at the University of Minnesota Extension have probably had some input in that. And so I feel pretty good about the work that we've been doing, in that we're starting to shift and change. Lack of culturally appropriate evaluation tools. So sometimes funders have their own evaluation tools and they don't fit very well with the work that we're doing. And so, you know, we have to negotiate and we have to work with them, and we have to create maybe our own tools that feel safe and feel good to our Indigenous relatives, and that capture that data that's important to report back. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. We just have to work maybe a little extra hard to figure out some ways that we can accomplish both. Let's see. So again, that rigorous component, sometimes community-driven projects aren't considered as rigorous as, you know, academic projects that, you know, papers are written in journal articles and all those types of things. But we need to kind of shift the thinking that people's lived experience is really important, in that some of us are in positions where we can translate that into ways that academic people or folks that really think in those that mindset can understand and appreciate. There aren't very many Indigenous evaluators, and so I'm so grateful to have Nicole join me in this journey. So I hope that by sharing what I'm learning and my enthusiasm for evaluation and Indigenous evaluation, that there'll be others that become interested too. And sometimes we just don't have adequate resources such as time and space. It takes time to develop relationships. It takes space that's set up in such a way that folks feel comfortable to learn. And okay, I think that's all I want to say about that slide. So it's a tool that we can use. We can learn more about our participants in our programs and how our education is impacting them. We're able to communicate with different teams and partners and funders about what we're doing and how significant it is that we're doing it in communities that historically have had information extracted from them and not a lot of information brought back to them in a way that feels good and that they understand in a good way. And of course, it can help us to inform and improve our programs, because that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that the education, the tools, and the resources and technical assistance that we're developing is meaningful and is useful to the participants that we're working with. So we have, well, Nicole, do you want to end?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, Chimigwech, that's big thank you, and Ojibwe, appreciate you participating, and remember that we have to keep practicing this stuff in order to get good at it. So you're not going to know how to do it from one hour webinar, of course, neither am I, but we can keep trying it and just doing our work in a good way, and that's all you can do to get better at it. I did want to make sure to give Mary Jo a chance to cover these last couple slides, and then maybe we'll have just a couple minutes at the end for questions. But Mary Jo, do you want to talk about these real quick before we do that?
Yeah, so if you want to be added to our newsletter and to receive information from the work that we're doing under our Rural Opioid Technical Assistance Grant for the Great Lakes Regional Center, please send your full name and email address to that email address listed on the screen, and this will also ensure that you will receive a certificate of attendance for attending this. And then, speaking of evaluation, we have an evaluation here that we would love everyone to fill out and provide feedback as well. So if you could do that, we will also send that in a follow-up email too. And this is being recorded, obviously, and it will be posted on our project website, and we will send that out to all participants as well. And so watch for that in case you want to share that with others.
And I saw there was a question in the chat a bit ago, which I wasn't able to do while I was sharing, but to share the link of that logic model video. So I'll do that right now, put that in the chat as well.
So I'm curious, I know we only have just a few minutes left, but what stood out to you? Where is kind of that next step for you in learning what you might want to take action on? And even if it's just a small learning, anything that Nicole and I shared with you today that really sparked your interest?
I think one of the things that really sparked my interest was someone mentioned using the 4 directions and balance in their evaluation approach, and I would love to learn more about that, like how they inject it into their evaluation approach.
I will find a link that I can share in the chat here. Hopefully I can find it quickly, but I developed an evaluation guide for culturally specific youth development programs. And in there, it shows an example of how to use like the medicine wheel concept, which is about balance, and holistic process toward healing, as opposed to just focusing on one segment of life. So I'll see if I can find that real quick and put it in the chat. That's one example anyway.
Anna says the idea of collective evaluation versus individual interests me. That's great. And then Susan says, I like the out-of-the-box thinking on the Lummi logic model. It opens my mind to other approaches. Yeah, spark some interest. I think the idea of individual versus collective is one that's pretty, that individual is often pretty common in Western education, Western systems, maybe Western ways of thinking. And there are a lot of other racial and ethnic groups that think in more of a collective way. And of course, that's not always true for either, either group specifically or exclusively, but in general. And so I think that those are some important things to think about, even if you're developing individual evaluations, to keep in mind that typically that Indigenous individual is thinking about their family, and the family might be different than a Western idea of family. Family and relatives can include the entire community. And so just having that understanding, I think, can change and shift things a bit in how we do evaluation. Yeah. The worldview of participants has to align with the intervention and the evaluation. Yes. Thank you. And Nicole and I are, well, I'll speak for you, Nicole. I think I can. We are open to any follow-up questions you may have. I don't know if our, maybe our emails will be sent out in the evaluation or contact information.
We can do that. We can do that. Yeah.
Okay. So please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions or thoughts you may have. And Chimigwich for spending the last hour with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.